We're going to first of all address the issue of the history of music. We've got it in three phases. We've put this together in three phases. We're going to touch on the history of music real quick, real brief, and then we're going to go into the rock and roll, the punk rock, new wave, hard rock, and LSD rock, and all the facets of rock and roll, the history of rock and roll. You'll be surprised where even the term rock and roll came from. First of all, I want to read some things to you, and this is a lecture kind of a meeting, so I'm going to be reading a lot of these things. I've put these down in notes to keep from forgetting. So bear with us as we read these things. First of all, I want to give you a definition of music. The art and science of combining vocal or instrumental sounds or tones in varying melody, harmony, rhythm, and timbre, especially so as to form structurally complete and emotionally expressive compositions. This is by a young man, Noah Webster wrote this. The source of music sprang from the heart of God for man's enrichment and enjoyment. We read in Psalm 40 verse 3, and he, God, hath put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto God. Many shall see it and fear and trust in the Lord. Before man was created, even before the angels were created, music was in the very being of God. Creation itself is God's musical. God has made an orchestrated musical when he began and created this earth. As he flung the stars into the heavens and the earth, it began to make a sound and began to flow together in a unity and a harmony, and it's produced one of the greatest symphonies probably ever done. I'm sure ever done. The universe and its galaxies and all the worlds present a melody and a harmony that reveal the musical heart of God. God created our lips and our lungs to sing forth praises and thanksgiving to him. Our hands have been given the ability to make instruments upon which we can make melody. God gave us hands that we could clap, and we could make melody in our hearts and with our hands and sing to the Lord. The Bible records many times when God's people burst forth in music and in song to honor the Lord. Exodus 15, there's the account of the Israelites' song of their deliverance when they had crossed the Red Sea. In the book of Psalms, David set to music both the joys and the anguish of his heart. When Jesus was first announced into the world, his coming, God chose the medium of music to reach man's heart. A chorus of angelic beings sang to the shepherds in announcing the child, the birth of the child. God even shook a prison once when Paul and Silas raised their voices in song to the Lord. He shook the very prison by their song, by their melody. We find in Ephesians a couple of scriptures here that I want to share with you tonight, because we want you to understand the basis and foundation of this music, rock and roll expose is founded and based upon the scriptures of God. Music is the Lord's. Ephesians 5 and 19 says this. Speaking to yourselves, I'm going to back up, read right here. It says, wherefore he saith, awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. And be not drunk with wine wherein excess, but be filled with the Spirit. Verse 19 says, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Colossians 3 and 16 makes another statement. It says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. Music has been a part of this generation, past generations. In the very beginning, when God created man, music has been a part of our existence. Though God is the source of music, we also see that Satan, or Lucifer, was the first musician. The scriptures teach that God created the angelic host, and they also imply the angelic host were the heavenly choir present at the very dawn of creation. And this heavenly choir was led by Lucifer, which we know today as Satan. Ezekiel 28:11 and 19 makes a few references, and so does Isaiah 14:12 and 17. I'll read just a little bit to you. And it suggests that Lucifer was heaven's song leader or heaven's choir director. This is very important for us to see here and understand, because this is where the origin, this is where the beginning of music and its fall took place. We saw that God created music. And I will show you now where music took its beginning of a fall and today has led to some of the things that we're going to see in a few minutes. It's where music has led to today, a thing called rock and roll. I want to read here in Ezekiel 28:11 and 19. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardis, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of the pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. And thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. And thou hast upon thy holy mountain of God, thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. And thou wast perfect in the ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. And by the multitude of thy merchandise, they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. I'd like to make a mention here that two things: iniquity, the pride that began to rise in Lucifer, and the violence began to rise within him. And it says, Therefore I will cast thee as a profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. And thy heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. And I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, and they may behold thee. And it goes on here and mentions other areas that Lucifer was cast down out of the heavens with his whole host. They were cast down to the earth, and we're going to see some things here as we go along. The scriptures tells us that Lucifer had the very workmanship of tabrets and the pipes in him the day that he was created. God made him the instrument of worship. All worship and praise, it says, we understand, flowed through him. And Lucifer was the anointed cherub. He had the ministry of music in him, and he was anointed in the ministry before God to lead the angelic host of heavenly choir. And Lucifer and the angels were created to do one thing: to worship God. In the midst of the divine music and harmony of all of creation and all creatures, Lucifer asserted his will against God's divine will. And Lucifer beheld his own beauty, wisdom, and anointing and ministry, and became lifted up in pride, arrogancy, and self-will. And rebellion manifested itself. And here's an important statement: when you see some things and hear some things, I'm going to play for you in a few minutes some tapes and albums that we have, that we've put together. We're going to play some things, and you're going to hear what's happened. Discord, which is the lack of harmony or a conflict of musical notes, entered the universe at that time. When Lucifer fell, at that point, discord and disharmony took place in that beautiful orchestral arrangement that God intended. When Lucifer exerted his self-will against God's will, it broke the harmony of God's universe. And at this point, Lucifer was cast out of heaven And there were two conflicting sounds in music. God's harmonious music and Satan and his discordant music. God did not strip Satan of the ministry of music. He still has it. And throughout history, there has been satanically inspired music that has the power to debate, degrade, and eventually destroy all of mankind. Music in itself is neither moral or immoral. It is amoral. In other words, it's without morals. And as we go through this study tonight, I want you to do this for me. I want you to hear very clearly. Because we're not stating that music, and you're going to see some other areas here, that music in itself is neither moral or immoral. It's amoral. Music itself. We'll make this clear in a moment. But the use of music makes it evil or good, destructive or edifying. And one must consider how it is played and why. Lucifer did not forfeit his ministry of music, he corrupted it. It has become one of his most powerful weapons that he has used to draw people away from God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now there are 5 elements of rock music which were stolen from God's intended use of music. First of all, the lively rhythm. How many of you thought that lively rhythm was something that Santana or the Beatles or the Doors or Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath, how many of you thought that that lively rhythm was something that they instituted and instigated? Well, I want you to see something. God is the one in the very beginning that instituted a lively rhythm. Psalm 150 is wrapped up in this one word, a great Hebrew study of a word called pizzazz. Pizzazz. Psalm 150 has got plenty of pizzazz. Moses spoke to Pharaoh to let God's people go. Now, it's an amazing thing. When Moses made this statement to Pharaoh, he said, "Let my people go." And when you check out the Hebrew and look back at the different words there, Moses was saying this to Pharaoh, "Let my people go to hold a dance and to worship the Lord." It says here, the Hebrew word meant a circle dance. When he said, "Let my people go," it meant a circle dance. And how many of you know when they got over the other side of the Red Sea that Miriam immediately grabbed her tambourine and began to dance as she played her tambourine? And you know, I've imagined it in my mind. I saw her dancing and swirling with her peasant clothes on, just began to swirl around and around. And that was why they were going out of Egypt, to go and dance and celebrate the great deliverance that God had done. Another area is simplicity. Simplicity. How many of you see the simplicity in rock and roll today? 2 or 3 words, which we're going to give some songs in a few minutes, and they say the same thing over and over. They have a 6.5-minute song that says 7 or 8 words continuously. One song that you're going to hear screams over and over and over, "Beat the brat with a baseball bat. Beat the brat with a baseball bat." And that's the whole intent and whole lyric of the song. Beat the bat with a baseball bat. On and on and on. Beat the brat with a baseball bat. That's simplicity. The simplicity of music today is easy to receive. Now I want you to hear this. 2 Corinthians 11:3 said, "But I fear, lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ." Christ is simple. Not him as a person, but what he is and what he's done for us is a simplicity there. Another area is repetition. Repetition. Heavenly worship is mentioned in Revelation 5 and 12. Singing with a loud voice over and over and over, worthy is the Lamb. Worthy is the Lamb. That's repetition. And another area is volume. Now, I know you parents have been persuaded and are convinced that the number 10 on that dial of that volume is something that Satan or somebody, an electrician, invented. I see a lot of smiles and waving. Well, I want you to know Satan is a deceiver and he is a counterfeit. And he cannot invent anything of his own. He has no ability to invent anything of his own. He only takes what God has invented and stretches it, distorts it, pollutes it, perverts it, and destroys it in the end. Volume in Psalm 33, verse 3, David said, "Sing unto him a new song, and play skillfully with a loud noise." With a loud noise. We see another example here. I want you to really take hold of this. There's a group right out today, a punk group, that they wear earplugs. It was just discovered recently. They wear earplugs when they play their concerts because their music has been deemed unsafe by environmentalists, and sound pollution is above levels that are safe for human beings. Now, they tested this group recently up in Boston, and the sound is louder from their music than the equivalent of a 747 sitting right beside you, taking off at full thrust. That's a loud sound. The fifth thing is improvisation. That means to play skillfully with the instruments. Jimi Hendrix didn't invent playing the guitar skillfully. He did not invent playing the guitar skillfully. Okay. Now I want to show you this as we go along while we've done this study. I wanted to lay that foundation. I wanted to lay that first foundation that you might understand that music began from God. And Satan has only taken it and polluted and destroyed it. All right? What is the purpose of this study? Ecclesiastes 7 and 5 makes this statement, and I think it sums up the gist of what we're saying here. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the songs of fools. And that's pretty clear. We must be knowledgeable of what is going on. God's Word demands that we be knowledgeable and be a knowledgeable people. Hosea 4 and 6 says, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." I want to show you something in a few minutes where rock and roll has gone and where it's gone into the church. I know that's going to interest a lot of you. It is our responsibility to promote godliness within our homes. Parents, as we go over this right now, this is to you. As a mom and a dad, which I am, this is addressed to us. There's a scripture in Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 7 says this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy heart, with all of thy soul, and with all of thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thy house, when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up." We as concerned parents and concerned Christians have a commission from God to let righteousness, to let clean, honest living prevail in our homes. It is our responsibility to reprove the works of darkness. Ephesians 5 and 11 says, "And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them." We hope to expose Satan's destruction through all areas of media tonight We want to show how the minds of both adults and children are being deceived. How many of you remember the Chipmunks? Well, I'm going to share a song of theirs in a few minutes. You mean the Chipmunks have gone rock and roll? I heard that somebody's thought was burning, and I picked that up. You mean they've gone rock and... Well, they've not only gone rock and roll, but the Chipmunks have gone punk. The Chipmunks are punking now. We'll see in a minute. We need to minister to the needs of our children and not to attack the outward manifestations. Moms and dads, hear me real clear tonight. We need to minister to the outward manifestations and not destroy our children. You rest on that for a few minutes. Luke 8:26-36 says, Jesus, ministering to the demonic of Gadarenes, people had tried to physically restrain him from chains, or with the chains he was bound with, which is the outward manifestation. But Jesus ministered to his needs, and he was set free. We minister to the love of the hearts of the children, not attack them. I hope and I pray tonight, if we do what we're going to do here, that none of you moms or dads will take what I'm saying in any way and take this and go home and use it for your campaign or your crusade to go to the bedroom and begin to attack the walls and attack the record stand and to begin to destroy both of these areas. That's not our purpose in doing this tonight at all. I'll pose this question to you for you to ponder on if you're one of those parents that's possibly thinking about doing that. Why and how did rock and roll get in your house in the first place? If we allow Satan to enter in our homes through the music that our children listen to, the Bible tells us that God's curse will be upon our whole household. Deuteronomy 7:25 and 26 says, the graven images of their gods shall ye burn with fire. Thou shalt not desire the silver or gold that is on them, nor take it unto thee, lest thou be snared therein. For it is an abomination to the Lord thy God, and neither shalt thou bring an abomination into thy house, lest thou be cursed like the thing of itself. But thou shalt utterly detest it, and thou shalt utterly abhor it, for it is a cursed thing. I think that's pretty clear. How many of you think that's pretty clear, that statement there? Now these men that wrote that, when these were spoken back there, they didn't have rock and roll music that they were contending with, but they had idols. They had idols, and I want you to know that Gene Simmons of Kiss, and David Bowie, and on, these men and these women, Gracie Slick and some of the other ones, have become heroes and superstars to a generation at this time. Used to be Superman and Batman and Spider-Man. Well, they've become to kind of take second place, and it's now the superhero stars of rock and roll and of punk. They've become their heroes. And you need to be real careful of how you deal with these heroes and your own children. We're going to show you tonight how to do this and how to come out victorious. Now we're going to go here, we're going to shift gears and go to the history of rock and roll. Now rock and roll began with a disc jockey in Cleveland by the name of Alan Freed. Rock and roll began, and its statement began with a disc jockey in Cleveland by the name of Alan Freed in 1954. He took the term rock and roll from the ghetto phrase which meant fornication. Rock and roll came from the very term fornication, It was used as a street gutter language of two people in the back seat of an old car, and that's where the term came from. It's a street slang, rock and roll. So it started right in the very gutter, in the very beginning. The music was a combination of black gospel, and African beat was the predominant part, and mixed with a little blues and a little jazz. There came the beat began to develop in the early 50s. And, you know, the name of rock and roll, it stuck out. And it's lived on, but I'll say this, that the pornographic insinuations and implications have risen to a greater proportion, I imagine, than this man Freed ever imagined. This man Freed, I don't think when he coined that term, rock and roll, I don't think he had any idea where it was going. But I have an inclination tonight of someone that did know where it was going. He knew, he intended, and he's done all that he can to see that it happened, and we've swallowed it. Now, I'm going to make a statement here that will really shock you, but a man said once, one quick way to carry it through its music. Now, this man knew what he was talking about, and his name was Lennon. His name was Lennon, not John Lennon, not John Lennon at all. Another man made a statement, an Englishman named Henry David Thoreau. He made this statement in 1854. Henry David Thoreau made this statement that music someday will destroy both England and America. It's a quote that David Thoreau made this statement that one day England and America would be destroyed by its very music. And how many of you have read the paper or seen the news lately and what's happening over in England in the streets? The riots and the problems that the English people are having with their young people out in the streets, destroying one another, killing one another, hurting one another. I believe that this man was saying something here that was possibly a God-inspired statement. And we're seeing a gradual merge now of the English music over to America. And I'm going to shock you here. There was one group that used music and their lifestyle to bring about a revolution in our society. It came from England also, called the Beatles. Called the Beatles. And I want you to remember that word, Beatles, because I'm going to show you something where that name came from in just a few minutes. But the Beatles made some very shocking statements, began to shock a whole civilization of people. Began to startle people with their long hair, it seemed at one time, and with their wild music and crazy beats and drums and shaking heads and all of that stuff. But you know, we really didn't even see what was really going on with that stuff. John Lennon made this statement. This is a quote again. Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and it will be proven right. We're more popular than Jesus is now. Well, we know, don't we, who survived. Paul made this statement, we probably seem to be anti-religious because none of us believe in God. Intelligent statement there. We probably seem to be anti-religious, none of us, because none of us believes in God. And George Harrison made this statement once, if a member of the Hare Krishna sect, as a member of the Hare Krishna sect, George Harrison, made this statement, says, I've learned more from the religious philosophies of India than anything I have ever learned from Christianity. And that's an obvious. And I want to do something right now. I want to share a statement with you, and then we're going to play a song. I'm going to play a song for you. How many of you remember the White Album by the Beatles? the White Album. It was a double album. And it had songs on it like Revolution, number 9, where they repeated themselves over and over and over and said, number 9, number 9. You remember that? And the last song behind that song is a song called Helter Skelter. Well, listen to this for a moment. Lawrence Z. Friedman made this statement. He has a career in studying maniac personalities, and he said this in People magazine. Charles Manson was at first a Beatlemaniac and came to believe that the lyrics of the White Album were commanding him to kill Sharon Tate and her whole company. In court, Charles Manson declared and said that the Beatles told him to go and kill Sharon Tate and this whole group. And I'd like to play a record for you right now that's called, it's off the White Album, and it's called Revolution number 9. And how many of you have heard us mention backward masking? Well, backward masking, we'll explain it in further detail, but actually what it is, it's a backward playing of music on an album that's done through an extreme, difficult process and has a distinct purpose in mind. And I can prove what it has in mind in just a moment. But the Beatles in the later 60s, they found their music business going downhill. You didn't hear about that, but they were losing their money left and right. From their big parties were reports of Paul McCartney crawling on his knees from hotel room to hotel room with no clothes on, where they had to totally isolate the entire hotel for them as they bashed in everything and broke everything and had just parties with girls and young teenagers all night, all day, for days at a time. These men began to lose their money that they had, and so they began to work in this process, and they began to use, to the extent of the very beginning, of what's called backward masking on records. Now, I want you to hear these words. You have to listen. You have to be very still and hear why Charles Manson said that the Beatles told him to kill Sharon Tate. Can we play that now? That forward for you so that you'd have an opportunity to hear. This came right off the album. Now we're flipping the tape over and you'll hear it. Turn it down a little bit. Back that up, Richard. Listen again. Now you have to listen, and it repeats itself over and over. Turn me on, dead man. 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 A lot of you can hear it. I think that's safe tonight, what we're saying here, that there's an obvious that's taking place. These men didn't accidentally dream this up. These men purposely began to do something with the inspiration of Satan himself, guiding them. The record soared right from that point. John Lennon and Yoko, right in the cover, right on the inside of the album when you open it up. Full nude shots of the two of them. Now they've censored parts, but there was parts that were not censored at one time. When it comes to America, we used to have great censored laws. Both of them, John Lennon and Yoko, laid out in Switzerland in a bed one time and just laid out in the middle of the street to protest the Vietnam War and they had just been married, and they, were enjoying themselves as newlyweds in the streets in Sweden. And somebody asked Yonko one time, asked her what she thought and what was a way to end the war in Vietnam. She said, for all the men to drop their pants. That's not a funny statement, that's a sick statement. That's a sad statement, somebody to make a statement like that. Many other groups and artists have used and are still using the medium of music to promote rebellion, drugs, illicit sex, and even the very occult and witchcraft into the minds of people, especially the youth in our society today. Gracie Slick of the Jefferson Airplane, and Jefferson Starship to be now, she made this quote, "The stage is our bed and the audience is our broad." And David Bowie made a sad statement. He's one of the first pop music stars to openly proclaim his homosexuality, and he had this to say about rock and roll. Now, this is one of the great artists today. His name is David Bowie, and he made this statement, "Rock and roll has always been the devil's music. It could bring about a very evil feeling in the West." Van Morrison claims he has experienced a spiritual transformation as a result of reading literature on Celtic history and the supernatural. Now, that Celtic history is witchcraft. On reading the witchcraft material, he's experienced a transformation. This is Van Morrison. Dr. John, another rock star, wears a voodoo necklace, and he is an ordained minister in the Louisiana Church of Witchcraft. He's an ordained minister of the Louisiana Church of Witchcraft. If you'll notice here, these people are interested in the supernatural. They're interested in spiritual things. You'll see this all through here. Now, Jimi Hendrix, another famous rock star who's no longer on the earth, Jimi Hendrix made a statement, and I have a slide here that I'd like for you to see. We could bring the lights down at this time. I hope this will come on. Oops, wait a second. That should have the light on. Now that's an album, and Axis, bold as, and it says love under there. But Jimi Hendrix was totally involved in spiritualism and in Eastern religion. And Jimi Hendrix, before he died a horrible death of an overdose of heroin, made this statement: music is spiritual. You can hypnotize people with the music, and then when you get them at their weakest point, you can preach into their subconscious what you want them to say. Music actually brings your subconscious to the point where you can drop in the exact lyrics you want them to hear, and they'll accept it. The Rolling Stones have ranged from the exposure of violent revolutions in the Street Fighting Man, one of the titles of their song. You could bring the lights back up, please. In the song Street Fighting Man, they promoted the violence that we see today. And to the anthem of Satanists, Sympathy for the Devil. That's another song by the Rolling Stones. Sympathy for the Devil. The group KISS declared in Rolling Stone magazine that the name of the group stands for Kings in Satan's Service. Now, it's been stated that it says Kids in Satan's Service, but this came from an actual quote of Gene Simmons in Rolling Stone magazine, that it says Kings. Their interpretation of it is Kings in Satan's Service. Gene Simmons made this statement: if God is so hot stuff, then why is he afraid to have so many other gods before him? a bold statement, isn't it? Now, we're seeing here as we go along that there's a definite perversion that's been set in course and a definite stealing that's going on. We're being stolen from today. And I want you to hear this now. How many of you know that when anything that Satan does, he attracts all kinds with him, and we call those kinds often antichrist organizations, right? Well, I wanted to bring this out real quick here. It says, groups such as the Beatles have pledged their allegiance to the Antichrist spirit. The Beatles press officer Derek Taylor, at the beginning of their 1964 tour, said this: "It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Here are these 4 boys from Liverpool. They're rude, they're vulgar, they're profane, they're taking over the world. Is it as if they have found a new religion? They're completely anti-Christ. I mean, I am anti-Christ as well. But they're so anti-Christ, they shock me, which isn't easy." Not only is there an anti-Christ spirit behind this music, but the Beatles and other groups and artists openly support communism through such songs as Back in the USSR, which endorses communism and Russia. On the cover of their Sgt. Pepper album, among the people surrounding the Beatles is a man that we all know named Karl Marx. When asked to comment, Ringo Starr made this statement: "We just thought we would like to put together a lot of people we liked and admired." This is one of the people that they admire, one of the people they liked. John Lennon made a statement. He says, "I'm wearing a Chairman Mao badge. I'm just beginning to think he's doing a good job." Now I want you to hear this. Over 64 million people were murdered by Chairman Mao in China for being anti-communist. 64 million people were killed through this man and through his reign there. And you know, John Lennon made that statement that he was totally in support and thought the man was doing a good job. Now, although the Soviet Union had banned rock music in the early 60s and found their juvenile delinquency rate went down 30%, now they got the idea, see, and they banned the rock and roll music out of Russia, okay, out of the Soviet Union. And when they did, 30%, the crime and juvenile delinquency rate fell 30%, but Radio Moscow could not resist playing the one song, Back in the USSR. Became #1 on the chart in the Soviet Union for a long period of time. Now, other companies that are owned and operated by communist nations, by communist leaders in our country here, how many of you have ever heard of MGA? Well, hold on to your seat, because they're owned, operated, and totally supported by communist countries. How many of you have ever heard of Folkway Records? Any of you have ever heard of Folkway Records? Joan Baez and Pete Seeger, these people? Totally, again, funded, controlled, men on the board are known communist leaders in America. Matter of fact, Joan Baez and Pete Seeger both are full-fledged communists. Pete Seeger in the early 60s went before a subcommittee in Congress, a congressional subcommittee on anti-American involvement here in this country. He faced senators and men addressing him on this very issue. Now, he came out of that clear, but repercussions came back later on it, and later and later, and it's still been a constant controversy. Now, another one is called, how many of you have heard of Children's Guild Records? Have you ever heard them? Again, owned and operated and connected with Folkways and supported and totally operated now by communist leaders. Now that's our children's music and books. Okay? Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones also has been known to be pro-communist. He attended the Fabian Socialist London School of Economics. Many of these rock stars are professing communists, many of them. Now we're being manipulated today. Music is in everywhere. You eat by it. Music today is everything. You eat by it, you shop by it, you sleep by it, and you wake up to it. Isn't that right? How many of you know that? You walk down the supermarket, and they play you music, you know, get you right in there, get you moving along down the aisle. You go into these fast, how many of you have ever been to Wendy's and heard them playing some musical orchestra? Never happened. It's always get you in, get you out, woo, make room for the next one. Music has that ability. It's the truth. Music, along with TV and other areas of media, employ the use of subliminal suggestion to implant various immoral images into the minds of not only young people, but adults as well. I'm just going to give you a quick part on this, and we're going to move on. Subliminal suggestion and subliminal is this: lying below the threshold of consciousness. Subconscious, it's a subconsciousness, that portion of mental activity of which the individual has little or no conscious perception. It's the portion of mental activity
Last week, a guy called with $1 million contract.